So, welcome everyone to today's podcast on Middle East Insights platform. And my name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary. And today we have a very eminent guest with us. It is Dr. Assal Rad, and she is a historian of modern Middle East. She has appeared at BBC World, BBC Persian, Al Jazeera, NPR, and she has been writing for Foreign Policy, The Independent, Newsweek. Along with it, her book is the recent book that she wrote was The State of Resistance: Politics, Culture, Identity in Modern Iran. Today, we are going to, in this aspect, talk about a very, very crucial, harrowing, and mind numbing context of annexation versus liberation. What is going on in Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights? What's exactly going on? So, with this, the first question that I have for you, Dr. Rad, is that Israel recently attacked Al Mawasi camp in Khan Yunis, where more than 20 tents were there. There are more than 1 million displaced Palestinians. In fact, the relatives had to dig 30 feet hole to find out the bodies of their loved ones. And at the same time, what has really disturbed everyone is the death of a 26-year-old Turkish American citizen who was in West Bank, Aysenur Ezgi. Biden has yet not called her family, supposedly. There has been massive uproar about it. She has been considered a martyr in West Bank. So, how do you see all of this emerging or developing in the context of West Bank and Gaza?
Well, if we're looking at, that's a few different topics to discuss, and they're all very important because they all fall under the umbrella of Palestinian liberation more broadly. There's actually this tendency to, in the Western narrative and in Western media, to separate these issues out. And that's not really an accurate way of talking about it, right? These things all go together. And what we saw in the West Bank, what we have seen in the West Bank for decades, is an ongoing military occupation. And with the killing of Aysenur Ezgi, a 26-year-old American, and there's a big tendency in the Western media narrative to also emphasize her Turkish origin, and that's to de-emphasize the fact that she's an American. Because when you look at the way that the Biden administration has reacted to Israeli Americans being killed versus a Turkish American being killed, what's the difference? It's who's doing the killing. Because Israel is the one that has killed Aysenur Ezgi, the reaction is completely muted. Now, why is Aysenur Ezgi? Why was she in the West Bank? She was in the West Bank as an activist, as a volunteer, someone who was trying to protect Palestinians who are being ethnically cleansed from their homes, as an ongoing ethnic cleansing that has happened for decades. And we've just seen an uptick in recent years, especially over the last year, since October 7th. Really, what the Israeli government has done is taken October 7th as sort of a banner excuse to do anything they want, whether it's genocide in Gaza or ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, the seizure of even more land in the West Bank, none of which belongs to Israel under international law. That's what we have seen unfold, and that's what Aysenur Ezgi was doing. She was, protesting along with other international activists, as well as Israeli activists, against this was in, I believe it was the Palestinian village of Beita, where you've actually seen other Palestinians be killed because you have settler mobs that are harassing and terrorizing Palestinians, that are forcing them from their homes. And Israeli forces are there when this is happening, right? They're absolutely present when Israeli settlers are harassing and violently pursuing Palestinians and expelling them from their homes forcibly. But Israeli forces not only do they do nothing to stop them, they actually protect the settlers, right? And because there's this other narrative within the West that talks about settler violence or extremist settlers. And that makes it seem like here's this fringe movement within the West Bank of Jewish Israelis who are acting outside of the norms of the state, when in fact, the occupation is the policy of the state. Settlements are the policy of the state, expansion of those settlements, annexation of the West Bank. All of this is Israeli state policy. And to separate those is entirely inaccurate in what is actually happening. This is a state policy. This is the Israeli government is officially seizing the land themselves that they've already occupied for such a long time. So that's what we're looking at in the West Bank and the killing of Aysenur Ezgi, who finally today, a preliminary investigation from Israel itself says that it's highly likely, and we've seen this pattern occur many times, it's highly likely that Aysenur was killed by an Israeli bullet. Well, there was no one else firing, right? There's no one else that's being accused of having fired shots. So it can't be anybody else's bullet. But this is how it's presented, because the way that the pattern goes is Israel is allowed to investigate itself. No independent investigations are allowed. Israel never finds fault with itself, and the incident becomes declared accidental. The United States echoes whatever Israel says, and there's no accountability, no justice, and the killing goes on. In Gaza, since you mentioned Gaza, the massacre again in the last 24 hours that we've seen, again, the argument that's stated by Israel is that they were targeting militants. The problem with that is this is what Israel has said now for 11 months, whilst they have killed tens of thousands of people, 17,000 children alone. 17,000 children alone have been killed. And this is all under the guise of, well, there are militants present. There are no international press is allowed in Gaza. No independent investigations are allowed. And so we're supposed to take the word of the criminal for the crimes that are being committed. If Israel says that they were targeting militants, this is treated as fact. But when Palestinians are killed, there's always doubt that's cast on that, right? It's not, 40 Palestinians killed. It's 40 Palestinians killed, say officials, says Palestinian run health ministry, says, there's always that sort of clause that creates doubt. But when Israel says that they're targeting militants, this is treated as fact. So there's a really huge problem in the way that this story is being told in the West, because we see what just unabated, with no accountability and impunity has created. A state in which when Israel is allowed to do whatever they want, they can even commit genocide. And there's absolutely no accountability for it.
That's true. And specifically when you question the legality or the truthfulness of facts. So for media students who are going to watch it, I would recommend that specifically headlines are the main bait for catching the readers, and one has to do justice to it. I would request all of you to go through Dr. Rad's Twitter account and see how she corrects the headlines and learn from it, because she's trying to speak truth to power. In many of these propaganda opinion pieces by the media that do not speak the truth to power. So, ma'am, why do you think that media is creating, though we stay in a post-truth world now, but why is media creating this kind of propaganda, taking into account that for the past 1 year, many international journalists have not had access to Gaza? I don't know about West Bank, but why is the media hegemony creating this propaganda?
Well, really, they're just repeating whatever their state official narrative is, right? And what's really interesting about that, in the West at least, when you live in the West, I'm an American myself, I grew up in the United States. This is, we grew up believing, or at least being told, that one of the foundational principles of a democracy is a free press, right? And this is something that every White House, every official sort of boasts about. Like, that's the pillar, one of the pillars of the Western free world, is that you have a free press. And that's juxtaposed with, say, state-run medias in, they'll say, a country like Russia or Iran or China, to the point where, if you remember, social media companies started to label certain media outlets as state-run media, right? To differentiate, as if to say, well, this isn't real news, this is state-run news, but this is real news, this is Western free press. what that means, what a free press means, is that you don't just say whatever the state narrative is. You look for the truth, you uncover the truth in many cases, because the states are often not providing you with truth. They're providing you with their own interest, whatever the government is that is in power. And the assumption is only that this is the case in non-Western states, right? There's no problem if I say, well, the Russian government lied about something. In the Western world, nobody will question that. But the idea that our own governments are lying about things for some reason is taken as some kind of impossibility, even though we know on record, on historical record, that is precisely what has happened. You do not have to go back very far to remember the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States and the fact that it was based entirely on fabrications and lies. What did the media do at that point? They didn't challenge it. They didn't question it. If the official narrative was there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, they would just repeat that. And so you're seeing that play out again now. And something I think, and I always like to make this distinction, because there is a difference between the individual reporters and journalists who are trying to do their jobs, many, many, many of which are trying to do their jobs, and the institutions that are not allowing them to do their jobs, right? And one example of that is The Intercept ran a story in April about a leaked New York Times memo, right? This was not meant to be public information. So in this leaked memo, reporters at the New York Times are being guided. They have certain guidance principles, and they're being guided not to use certain language, avoid words like genocide, Palestine, occupation, refugee camp. And even before this leaked memo, you could see, I mean, if you were paying attention, you can see the words that they avoid. But now when you have this leaked memo and you put it next to these headlines and the language that's being used, you can see how hard they try to avoid those exact words, right? It's never called a refugee camp. Palestinians are not called refugees. They're called displaced people. It's called a school turned shelter. It's called a former school in some cases. This kind of twist of language is used because they're for some reason not allowed to use a very simple phrase, refugee camp, occupation. And so genocide, right? That they're supposed to avoid saying genocide, or Palestine altogether, which is an erasure of Palestinian identity. Those are institutions that are not allowing reporters to do it. And that's where the real question lies, is why are these institutions of power not allowing the space for a free press to do their job, to do what they're supposed to do? And you can also see this in White House briefings and State Department briefings. There are journalists in that room asking the hard questions. They're just not getting any answers, right? They get the same boilerplate answers day after day after day. We're still investigating. Israel is investigating. We've talked to our Israeli counterparts. It's the same non-answers every day. And so the criticism is of the institutions, whether it's our state institutions, our governmental institutions, or our media institutions, and the fact that they are not challenging the narrative, and they're acting not only as stenographer, and this is the really interesting thing, not only as stenographer for the US government, but for the Israeli government. The Israeli media is often more honest than the Western media in talking about Israeli government officials. And that's something that should really cause question for a lot of people.
That's true, because it makes one think about this entire gatekeeping of how the various agendas are set by the media, the entire market and state collaboration, funding that goes on with the media houses, why such memos are produced, felt that they were guilty of their conscience in not reporting the truth. Now, coming to West Bank.
I wanted to add something to what you were saying, because actually that is also true of the governments themselves, right? We have seen in the US government, in the State Department, resignations.
Yes.
Right? People are resigning from the State Department. Yes. We've seen White House staffers send letters to the White House officials. We've seen staffer letters criticizing the Biden administration's policies. So it's not even within these institutions, even within the government itself, like none of these institutions are monoliths. There are people who see what is happening and they take great issue with it, to the point where they are resigning from their post because they cannot in good conscience contribute to what they see as crimes against humanity. I mean, the worst crimes against humanity that you can see. So it really tells you how small the sort of group, or the people who are actually controlling the levers are, that are not listed, are not heeding the calls of their own staff, whether it's within the newsroom or whether it's within the White House.
No, that's true. We talked with Sarah Lee Whitson, and she gave examples of Josh Paul and many others who had resigned. But the entire question which I asked her was that do they now have any kind of challenges from the deep state on their life, on security? And one of the aspect that she did mention was that how they were a bit worried about the financial future in the current US economy and what impact it would have. But nevertheless, a lot of Palestinian Americans, Jewish Americans, they have resigned on the state
Yes.
policy of the Biden administration. But it doesn't make any difference so much to the administration as yet. So the next question, ma'am, is about West Bank. When we talk about West Bank, most of our viewers don't know that it is divided into area A, B, C, supposedly. So when was it actually occupied by Israel? In what condition? In what context? And how many settlers are there? What is area A, B, and C in West Bank?
So the West Bank was occupied by Israel in 1967 after the war in 1967. But the division, this ABC division, doesn't happen until many decades later, into the early 1990s during the Oslo Accords. It's actually under the Oslo Accords that you see this division where Area A, and it was supposed to be part of the Oslo process, right? One of the things that's incredibly frustrating for anybody who has followed this issue for many years is that there's every US administration talks about a two-state process or a Middle East peace process. And that's sort of rooted in the idea of the Oslo Accords that happened in the early 90s. But under the guise of a peace process, Israel has continued its occupation and expanded its occupation. So under the Oslo Accords, you had Area A, which I believe is about 18% of the territory in the West Bank, under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was actually created during the Oslo Accords as well in order to be like a government institution within the West Bank for Palestinians. Area B is about 22% of the land, and that is controlled mutually, but the security control is by Israel, the civil service control is by the Palestinian Authority, and then the rest, 60%, which is Area C, is entirely and fully controlled by the Israeli military. But when we say Area A, B, and C, the whole thing essentially is under Israeli military occupation, in the sense that, and this is why Israel is an apartheid state. When they say it's an apartheid state, the point that is being made is that Israel controls the lives of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. They exert control over their lives. But those people whose lives they control do not have a vote. They don't have a vote. They don't have representation. They don't have equal rights. And then you see the way that it manifests within the West Bank, where you have literal divisions of land that is only for Jewish Israeli settlers. Palestinians cannot live there. Land, by the way, that is sometimes sold in the US, right? There are synagogues that have hosted real estate events that have gotten protests. And then the way that the media casts those protests is, anti-Semitic protests in front of a synagogue, without understanding that, there are many, many, many synagogues in the United States. They're not getting protests every week. Why those specific synagogues were selected on the days that they were selected was because they were hosting real estate events that was selling Palestinian land in the West Bank to Jewish Americans, right? So this is the level to which you see the expansion of settlements and land loss that has occurred. But even under A, B, and C originally, 60% of the land was under full Israeli control. It also happens to be that about 2/3 of the fertile agricultural land in the West Bank is in Part C. You have roads that are for Jewish Israelis only. You have checkpoints, you have forces that are there to enforce checkpoints. So Palestinians are not free to move about in their own land. And this has gone on for decades. And what what Israel has announced recently, just a few months ago, was the largest seizure of land in the West Bank since 1993. It's since the last 3 decades, basically. Now, the way that this is framed in the media, you'll see a lot of headlines in the Western media that says Israel approves settlements or the building of homes. Those settlements are illegal. Every settlement is illegal. In fact, the International Court of Justice, just in July, ruled that Israel's occupation, not only of the West Bank, but of Gaza and East Jerusalem, all of that is illegal under international law. And one of the arguments that's often been made about Gaza specifically is, well, Gaza wasn't under Israeli occupation, right? Gaza was independent. Israel withdrew from Gaza in, I believe it was 2006 or 7. Well, the court disagreed with that. The court says, no, because of Israel's de facto control of the Gaza Strip by land, air, and sea, it is also under occupation. So they don't have to have physically present in Gaza, but because they control what can go in and out, they're still occupying it. If you think about the blockade and the siege on Gaza, that's part of the occupation that is being carried out by Israel. So when you talk about the two-state solution, these are the things that we have to consider and think about. What do they mean by two states? Do they mean two states as in the Gaza Strip and little enclaves in the West Bank? Because that is not what Palestinians are, that's certainly not what Palestinians are referring to, because that's not what the recognized territory under international law is. What is recognized under international law since 1967, that has been enshrined in UN resolutions, is that the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip are all Palestinian territories, and Israel has no right to that land.
That's true, because, and it's interesting that you talk about Oslo, because it's going to be 31 years on 13th of September, a process that didn't bring peace. And it is true, like when I specifically went to West Bank through Jordan, it was for 8 hours that we were stopped at the entry checkpoint. And then I saw a lot of Palestinians who were just working, who work on a daily labor basis in Jordan, returning, and the kind of treatment that was met to them. The frisking, the ransacking of their bags, throwing away their luggage, checking everything, the dehumanization which was there. And I was completely flabbergasted because I had never seen one human treat another human with so much of barbarity.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that for 8 hours. And it really changed my perspective on power and what power can do.
You can see that actually, that when you talk about that, it's very true, that sort of daily humiliation, right? That's part of it. That's part of, it's become part of the occupation, is to also humiliate and dehumanize Palestinians. And you can see that now in the social media posts of Israeli soldiers in the last 11 months. Just very bizarre kind of treatment, right? You see them happily destroying homes, destroying property, wearing women's lingeries, playing with children's toys. These are people
right to rape. Right to rape.
Arguing for the right to rape as a, and what is that in that sense, right? It is rape in that context is power and humiliation, and it's the ultimate form of showing power and humiliation over another human being, and that's precisely the way that it is being wielded. So you see what happens when there is no accountability. When there is never any accountability, when you've allowed for decades this daily humiliation that you're describing, the most extreme form of that is what we've seen over the last 11 months play out. And that's why you see genocidal incitement, genocidal language from the top, from the very top, from the Prime Minister of Israel to ministers within the cabinet, to members of the Knesset, military officials, news anchors, people within the society. So much of it has been taken over by the fact that there has not been for a very long time any check put in place to sort of stop and treat Palestinians for what they are, which is human beings. That's what dehumanization does, and that is what decades of dehumanization has now led to.
No, that is, and you know what they do? They put a mark on your passport. So 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever, and how dangerous you are. Whether you'll be allowed if you're 4 or it's okay, you can be allowed. But if you're 3, 2, 1 or whatever, then you'll be immediately deported. And it completely uh, alien, such a alien culture of dehumanization that it really felt quite, for me personally, it felt disgrace to be a human being to watch that and not do anything. But that is how the power goes. So turning to this silent annexation that is happening in West Bank, why do you think, though it's very premature to ask this question, but why do you think no policy change or uh, any kind of aspect of West Bank is being talked about with the same kind of rigor as that of Gaza, though I understand that both of them are asymmetrical. And a lot of Gazans and West Bank residents do not have WhatsApp connectivity now. They are also not having digital representation on LinkedIn or many other platforms. Twitter often keeps blocking me out when I talk about Palestine. So, what do you think? Why the silent annexation of West Bank is not discussed in policymaking, and how is it discussed in the media?
So I think first, and you pointed to this, the asymmetry, right? One of the reasons why Gaza is often, especially right now, obviously what is happening there is the worst, worst, worst crimes against humanity are being carried out on a daily basis for people to see. The horror of what people have seen every day for 11 months straight is why there is so much attention focused on Gaza. And even if you look over the history in recent decades, there have been other wars carried out by Israel in Gaza that have not nearly on this scale, but have similarly, the language that they use is sort of mowing the lawn. They go in every few years, bomb Gaza, kill a few thousand people, destroy a bunch of infrastructure, and then the cycle starts over. It's just that this time it has gone so far and reached such an egregious level that I think it's sort of taken the mask off entirely of what people thought what you could call a military incursion or a war. This is not a war. This is a genocide. You are killing civilians indiscriminately for months. We've all seen it. Now, when you look at the West Bank, there's that asymmetry, but also it's because of the kind of legal language that is used, right? So what the Biden administration will argue is that they have made a policy change. For instance, sanctioning a number of individual settlers who have carried out or have contributed to violence in the West Bank. Now, the problem with that is it's not a real policy change because those individuals are not the problem. That doesn't address the policy. The policy is the policy of the Israeli government. And they have been asked this by reporters in the briefing room. How can this administration say that when they acknowledge that the settlements are illegal under international law, they will rhetorically say that they oppose the expansion of settlements. They will condemn Israeli settler violence. But what they won't do is go a step further, which is the truth, to say that settler violence is state violence. And this isn't something I'm saying. This is something that B'Tselem, a renowned Israeli human rights organization, has said for years. Settler violence does not exist in a vacuum. It exists because it is the policy of the state. And so as long as the United States is providing the weapons for the military that is occupying the West Bank, for the military that is protecting those very settlers as they attack Palestinians, as long as it's not the Israeli government that is being sanctioned and just these individual settlers, you're not addressing the policy at all. So that's me sort of getting at what the other side will say. Well, they say, well, they sanction these individuals. That's not a policy change. And the reason they don't change the policy, there's a parallel if you look at the peace process and then if you look at the ceasefire process that we've dealt with in the last several months. And here's the parallel. What US officials will say, and this is what they've said for decades, is that, well, there's a peace process, right? We're negotiating a two-state solution for 30 years. For now more than 3 decades, they've been negotiating a process in which The material situation for Palestinians has gotten worse and worse and worse. There are more settlers, more settlements, more violence against Palestinians, more loss of land. And this is during a peace process settlement that has taken more than 3 decades and has resulted in absolutely nothing. But as long as that process is sort of pending, then that's the language that they'll continue to use. So that's why it happens silently in a way. It's like, well, yes, these settlements are expanding, but eventually down the road, we're going to have a solution and we're working on that solution. So in the short term, there's nothing that needs to be done about this because we're working on the bigger solution. Same thing that happens with the ceasefire. Every time the Biden administration is asked about the next massacre, the next war crime that Israel has committed, their response now is, that's why we're working on a ceasefire. So as long as this negotiation of a ceasefire is pending, nothing has to be addressed, right? When they're asked about the killing of 6-year-old Hind Rajab, when they're asked about the flower massacre, when they're asked about aid workers being killed, journalists being killed, all of these things that are clear war crimes, the US has still not come out to say definitively that Israel has broken international law. The most that they've said is that it's reasonable to assume that that has happened, but they have not definitively said it. Why? Because there are laws in the US that say you cannot provide military aid and weapons to countries that are blocking aid, that are blocking humanitarian aid, that are carrying out crimes against humanity. We are legally, in the US, this administration is not allowed to do it. So how do you get around that legal loophole? You have a pending case. The case is pending. And as long as it's pending, nothing has to be addressed. Same thing with the ceasefire. We talked about the difference in the way that the media approaches things. There have been protests in Israel with hundreds of thousands of Israelis participating in protests, demanding that the Netanyahu government sign a deal, agree to a ceasefire to release all the hostages. This narrative, this has been covered in Israeli media. Israeli hostage families blame Netanyahu. This is not covered in Western media. Even yesterday, John Kirby was asked about the ceasefire negotiations. He specifically said Hamas is the main obstacle. Nothing about the fact that Netanyahu has added conditions that he knows not only go against anything that the Palestinian side will agree to, but even against what the US itself said. The US position is that there can be no occupation of Gaza. And yet, Netanyahu is calling for a partial occupation of Gaza. And so this is how it becomes silent. It gets, under this legal language of, well, we're working on the solution. And as long as they're working on a solution, the problem in the immediate is never dealt with. And that's essentially what we've seen with the entire peace process and the fact that the West Bank is in the condition that it is currently in.
No, it really makes me, it makes me think about the words of Rachel Goldberg, mother of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin. And she wrote a very moving message. And she says that when you only get outraged, even though she has lost her son, she says that when you only get outraged when one side's babies are killed, then your moral compass is broken and your humanity is broken. Hatred is easy, but hatred is not helpful, nor is it constructive. War and conflict always ends up hurting the innocent, which is why war is so brutal and devastating. In a competition of pain, there's never a real winner.
Yes.
And these are very, very deep, heartfelt words written in such a difficult process of mourning. And were not really covered by any of the media outlets. So this was being done silently. But what about things which are not very silent? For example, Netanyahu showcasing a map which doesn't have West Bank at all.
You bring up that statement, and it is, it's so frustrating to see the way that these narratives play out, because when you advocate for Palestinians, oftentimes the assumption is that means you're against Israelis or you're against just Jewish people across the world. And nothing can be further from the truth for people who are advocates of peace. Being anti-genocide is not being anti-Jewish. being anti-war is not being, against the hostages. In fact, one of the frustrations is the fact that the hostages should have been released they should never have been taken, and they should have been released from the very beginning. And when you look at, and again, this is in Israeli media, you cannot find these stories in Western media. But when you look at, the Times of Israel has a story from hostage families, from hostage negotiators that say that the hostages could have all been released October, 8th, 9th, 10th. And that if Israel would not invade Gaza. And of course, that was never going to be the case because that's not what the Netanyahu government wanted. There is a story in the Jerusalem Post, another Israeli media source, that says that Netanyahu basically told hostage families that Israel's security objectives were more important than saving their loved ones. I mean, this is just openly being said in Israeli media. But you don't see those stories on the US side or really in Western media at all. And it takes away from the idea that when people are saying they want a ceasefire, they don't just want to save the lives of Palestinians. They also want the hostages to be freed. This is what the UN, by the way, called for months ago. The very resolution that the United States vetoed called for not only an immediate ceasefire, but also the unconditional release of all hostages. So then when the hostages are used, when the language of the hostages are used to justify what is happening, because it's to get the hostages, that's rendered meaningless. Because if you really cared about, if the hostages were the issue, then they could have been freed long ago. So many of those who have been killed, their lives could have been saved. Not only the hostages, but thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Palestinians. And it really is a disservice to humanity when it's not treated that way. So I can't, sometimes the capacity for someone who has experienced such great loss to have that kind of humanity is really, it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
But sorry, you mentioned, I was lost in that statement, and you mentioned the map. Yes. So Netanyahu has held a press conference last week for international press where he used a map. He was trying to make an argument for why the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt requires a presence by the Israeli military. And when he showed the map, there was no West Bank. There was a little carve out. He put Gaza. West Bank was gone entirely. And this is not the first time he's done this. This is the other thing that people, need to keep in mind. Before October 7th, right? And the other issue is that people relate everything to October 7th, but many of the things that the state of Israel have been doing predate that by, months, years, decades. In September of last year, at the UN General Assembly, he also showcased a map that showed nothing. It was just, there was no Gaza, there was no West Bank. And so this is done over and over again. Now, these are the same people who say, if you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that is a call for the extermination of Israel, and it's genocidal, it's anti-Semitic. Right. This is how people are attacked for what is really a call for Palestinians living anywhere in between the river and the sea to be free. That's what the call is for. They should be free anywhere they're living. Whether it's in Israel proper, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in East Jerusalem. Palestinians should be free. They should have equal rights. The same people who are saying this have no problem with a map that entirely erases the West Bank. And what's interesting is in that press conference last week, a reporter did ask. He said, can you bring back that map? Can we take a look at that map? And they put the map back, and he said, and he used this exact point. He said, you talk about the idea that these groups talk about the, wanting to erase Israel from the map, and you have literally erased the West Bank from this map. How is that not problematic? And Netanyahu sort of goes into this very long, incoherent rant where he invoked, the Iran, Hamas, the Holocaust. He attacked the press for saying that you guys are not providing, accurate information. And he was very, very aggressive in his response. He referred to it as Judea and Samaria, right? It's not the West Bank. And he even attacked the ICC. He said, he compared the Palestinian Authority going through a legal channel, like the International Criminal Court, to Hamas, and they're the same things because both of them ultimately want the same thing, the destruction of Israel. And so where is the space? If Palestinians do not even have legal recourse under international law, what can they do? Where do they have rights? I mean, what they're telling, we should believe Israeli officials when they're saying things. They're telling you they don't have rights. They're calling them animals. You have Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, calling them human animals. You have the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, saying this narrative of innocent people is not true. So they're telling you what they think. They do not think of them as human beings. They do not think that they deserve equal rights. You have people like Ben Gvir, who's an Israeli minister, again, last year, before October 7th, saying openly on Israeli media that his right, his wife's right, and his children's rights are more important than that of Arabs. So they're openly telling you these things. And all of this is not only denied in the Western narrative, it's not even in the Western narrative most of the time. It doesn't even exist in it. So you wouldn't know that these things are happening unless you were really, really paying attention to social media, your own sources, or media outside of the West.
Yep. And also one thing which is missing in the discourse of the Western media is necropolitics. For example, polio has emerged again in Gaza. Today, for 8 to 10 hours, the UN workers were not allowed to go to Gaza. They were stopped, halted. There are a lot of Palestinians who are also apprehensive about the polio vaccination. When it comes to their own safety, they don't trust it. But this kind of necropolitics and the emergence of polio in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of it, all of that is also missing from the narrative of the West. So how do you scrutinize it?
Well, when you bring up polio, that's an important example of again, if you look at the Western narrative, you see a lot about the vaccination efforts, right? Because that makes the state of Israel look good. Oh, look, see, they're not trying to harm them. They're vaccinating them. Yes, except they created the conditions that created polio outbreak, which, by the way, also puts Israelis in danger because it's a disease that as an outbreak would not be good for anybody. So of course if something can be an epidemic that can affect themselves, they're going to vaccinate the population. But they created the conditions that created the spread of disease. Now the polio vaccination rollout is just happening within the last few weeks. The World Health Organization warned about the spread of disease in November, right? When they already had detected polio, Israel started vaccinating their own soldiers before. It wasn't until there was international pressure that Israel had to roll out vaccinations for Palestinians in Gaza. And something else to keep in mind, one of the reasons why there was such a concern for the spread of disease is because Israel has destroyed water sanitation systems. Israel has destroyed healthcare facilities, hospitals. I mean, basically the entire infrastructure of a society has been destroyed. And that's why it's called genocide, because the ability for Palestinians to live in Gaza has been destroyed, right? And that's why you see the spread of disease, of a disease something like polio. When you talk about trust, some people might think that that's odd, right? Some people listening might think, well, why wouldn't they? Why? No one's going to, tamper with a vaccination. Think about this. How many Americans didn't take the COVID vaccine because they didn't trust the government? That's American citizens, right? American citizens did not trust their own government. Many did not trust, many millions did not trust their own government, and so they refused to take the vaccine. Now imagine a country who's killing you. It's not so far-fetched that there would be distrust. Now, I'm not saying that there's something nefarious about the polio vaccinations. I don't think there is. You have international organizations, you have the UN who's actually helping roll it out. And so that's not the argument I'm making. It's simply about the perception. Why would there be mistrust? Because these are people who've been killing you nonstop for not just for months. I mean, we talk about these last 11 months, but really for decades. So it's not so odd that they wouldn't necessarily have trust in that system.
That's also with good cause. A lot of people in UK and US have filed lawsuits against Pfizer and Moderna on the impact of COVID vaccination on their bodies, causing clots in the brain and so many other things. And we don't know, the vaccination attempt all over the world happened so quickly, with the sampling and the testing done so quickly, that it's bound to have any kind of after effect. And also that Pfizer and Moderna did not share the patent with the US government, and it was more like a capital system of making money. So distrust within vaccinations is something which is quite understandable from specifically a victim's side of point of view.
Absolutely. But in the case of Gaza, there shouldn't have been a polio outbreak.
At all, yes.
Condition should never have been allowed to happen. And the warnings were there for many, many, many months from international institutions across the board. Doctors Without Borders talking about the spread of disease because of the breakdown of the healthcare system. UN experts, the World Health Organization, countless NGOs. I mean, this has been said over and over again. This is in October and November of last year. The alarm bells were already going off. But when there was no attempt to contain what Israel was doing, this is the natural consequence of that. So you also can't sort of be in the situation where they're not culpable for it, because you've been warned for months that this is if someone tells you, hey, if you do this action, this will be the consequence, then when the consequence happens, you're responsible for it because you've been told that's exactly what will happen if you continue this course. And that's what we've seen them do.
It doesn't really, matter to Netanyahu specifically. Hamas, for example, has been Netanyahu's Frankenstein monster. When the entire funding for Hamas,